was sleeping in the same bed as my grandfather, and it was completely normalized for a 6-year-old, a 7-year-old to sleep with their grandfather alone in bed. He was molesting me. There are at least 2 documented incidents in some police reports that were later filed. My 2nd grade classroom, my teacher had shown a child sexual abuse awareness video when I was about 7. It was a video about good touch, bad touch. I saw this video in my 2nd grade classroom, and a light switch just kind of flicked on in my head, and I realized that what was happening between my grandfather and I was not normal. I told my mom what was happening, and that was it. My mom had known that in addition to, this anxiety that I was experiencing at school, there were several other things that were kind of going wrong with me. I would come back from visits with my grandparents and I would look spaced out. I looked very neglected. I was talking about wanting to die by the time that I was 9. At that point, I was 7 years old. And suddenly it all made sense to her. So my mom, really just jumped into action. She called some friends. She called the police. Pretty soon detectives were coming over to my house interviewing me. I had a case manager from the Children's Services Division. Because my parents' divorce had been so contentious, that case manager happened to alert my dad, who was working as an assistant district attorney in the Umatilla County court system. So my dad was tipped off that I had made these allegations. We suspect he took the day off of work, and he went to my grandfather's house, summoned all of the relatives, and they met from like 5 p.m. to 1 a.m., just various relatives kind of circulating in and out. And they came up with an alibi. And that alibi was that he could not have molested me because he had been trampled by some cows. They were basically saying that there is just no physical way that this could have happened. And that just simply was not true. My recollection of the events was very solid. I was assigned a therapist, and I was put into group counseling with other little girls like myself who were reporting they had been molested as well. There was enough evidence for my grandfather to be charged with a count of rape and then another count of child sexual abuse. A trial date was set. But what happened was my grandfather had spent $30,000, which at that time was a huge amount of money, to hire a legal team, and they pushed the trial. So by the time that I got to testify, a full year had gone by. And so my memory was not as strong, but a whole series of events had kind of transpired in that year. So I found out that my dad had hired a polygraph examiner to do a polygraph exam of my grandfather in a motel room in Pendleton in February 1985. He failed this exam spectacularly. My dad thought he was going to pass it with flying colors. And then in April of that year, when the original trial date was supposed to be set, my dad started showing up at my school unannounced. And back in those days, any parent could walk in and just strike up a conversation with a teacher. You didn't have to check in at the front office. So my dad started talking to my principal, my teacher, my counselor, trying to get them to see his view of what happened. My mom pulled me out of school. I finished out the year at a private school. My dad had tried to show up at that private school, and he was turned away, thankfully, by the director of that very small private school. But what my dad was effectively doing, and he knew it as a prosecutor, was that he was trying to sway a witness. He was trying to badger me and get me to back down. And I was not backing down in my story because I just held so steadfast to what happened. I testified for about an hour and 45 minutes against my grandfather in court, and my mom was not allowed in the courtroom with me. They had intentionally called my mother in as a witness, asked her 4 very basic questions. When you're called in as a witness in a trial, you can't be in the courtroom for the duration of it. So very, very cruel tactics were used to keep me isolated away from my mother. And they had also painted my mother out to be like crazy, and they said that she was trying to coach me, which was just absolutely bonkers, because that was just never happening. So I had meltdown after meltdown on the witness stand. I was 8.5 years old, and while I was being asked these very invasive questions by old men, basically in a courtroom that was surrounded with my paternal relatives. They had packed the courthouse with my paternal relatives so that when a recess was called, I would have to walk past them out to my mother, who was waiting outside the courtroom doors. And what we didn't know at that time was that there were 2 other women who had been interviewed by police, and they were friends of one of my aunts, and they initially said that my grandfather had, one said that he had touched her on the knee, another said that he had, I think maybe grabbed her breast or something along those lines. So my grandfather was a chaperone for both Future Farmers of America and 4-H, and so it was on these trips that he chaperoned, and my grandfather basically said that he wanted to sleep alone in motel rooms with 12-year-old girls. That information was not allowed to be admitted into evidence. So the trial was basically riding solely on my testimony, and those women were either paid off or something was done, because they backed down, and they have not ever talked to me. I've reached out to them multiple times. I've tried to get them to engage with me, and they have not. It was a 3-day trial. The jury debated, and then they came back and decided that he was not guilty. I was devastated. I thought I'd failed. I just wanted my grandfather to go to jail. After that, my life resumed as quote-unquote normal. I was in 3rd grade at that time. I struggled in school. I was able to, finish out my 3rd grade year. And the following summer, my mom called the Umatilla County Courthouse to try and get the court records of the trial. And she found out that not only was there my grandfather's trial, there was another trial. There was a civil lawsuit that my grandfather had filed with the help of my dad against the state of Oregon, my therapist, the social workers, the detectives, and it was a defamation lawsuit for $1 million. My mom was able to get her hands on all of that court documentation. These 2 women that I talked about earlier, they were subpoenaed. They had to testify. So there was just lots of documentation about, their involvement. My dad's involvement was also, he was subpoenaed. He had to testify. And that's essentially where my mom was able to find out about, this meeting with the family where they had developed the alibi. When my mom had originally called to get the documentation from that, she was only able, because she was a single mom, she was in graduate school, she had no money. She was only able to get my testimony from that trial. And then she was able to get the full testimony from this civil suit. A few months later, she actually had some money, and she called the courthouse again to see if she could get the rest of the court documentation. The court clerk told her that they had been lost in a flood. I have lots of doubts around that. My mom graduated from her college, and then we moved to Roseburg, which is a town in Southern Oregon. I think it was during that time that my dad had remarried, and he had decided that he was going to file a custody lawsuit. When I initially disclosed that I was being molested, what was relayed to my mom was that he believed me. And then he switched. He decided he wasn't going to believe me. That was devastating to have your own father side with his dad, who had been accused of molesting me. He should have been standing there with me. There was like a creek that my dad would take my sister to, feed these ducks. And when he came to pick her up, I would hide. I did not want anything to do with him. I was so mad. I was frightened, absolutely frightened, that I was going to potentially have to see my grandfather again. It was right before the custody filing that my sister had been put into her own therapy because she was pulling little boys aside in her preschool trying to kiss them. And the preschool teacher was like, the hell is going on? This is not good. She was put into therapy, and it came out that my dad was molesting my sister. I'm fairly certain my sister saw what I went through and decided she did not want to go through what I went through. I mean, a police report was filed. The therapist was, keeping detailed drawings my sister was making of what took place. My sister's, not to compare, but my sister's abuse was much worse than mine. My sister decided one day that she was going to recant, and which is unfortunate, but at that time there was this whole movement about false memories, and to this day I believe my sister was molested, and she claims to not have any memory of what happened. But those drawings and the police report were used in this custody trial. And my mom, thankfully she found someone who was willing to take it, and he won. I was not at that trial. The way that he was able to win the trial was just very, very simple. My dad had brought in 30 character witnesses to vouch for my dad and what a great dad he was, and they tried to make my mom out to be this raging, horrible, basically, who was an alcoholic. And my mom had been in recovery for years and years at that point. We didn't know this until later, but the judge also happened to be a recovery alcoholic and kind of saw through what my dad was doing, trying to paint her to be this horrible person. So we think that, probably played a part. And also the fact that my sister had made all these allegations. And so the judge in that trial ordered my dad to a polygraph. He ordered him to court supervised visits only. He ordered him to have what's called a penile physismograph, where basically your penis is hooked up to this machine and you're shown child. I think it's some 1980s device of trying to determine if someone's a sex offender or not. And so he basically was able to use his legal clout to get out of taking this polygraph, and he did not ever take that physismograph, and he basically forfeited his right to have any contact with my sister and I. After that point, he did not go through with any court supervised visits. He chose his legal career over my sister and I. And at that point, he had moved up from assistant district attorney in Umatilla County to district attorney. And then several years later, in 1992, he became a judge in that county. Even though my mom and the attorney filed bar complaints against my dad, the Oregon State Bar did nothing to stop any of this. My dad was a judge from 1992 to 2011, and he's still practicing law. After he lost, I was, basically raised by my mom. I was just a very quiet kid, and we did, my mom, we were moving around a lot. My mom couldn't quite get settled in where she wanted to live. And so it was really hard to, establish friendships. My mom was basically alone because her family was all in Maine and Massachusetts. And so my mom was just, bootstrapping it, single parenting. I kind of was bouncing in and out of, therapy, which I think, was very beneficial in terms of, emotional regulation, because I never knew what any of my diagnoses were. And I suspect at that time it was just anxiety, but today, I have PTSD as a result, diagnosed by a therapist. In 8th grade, my mom finally landed somewhere, and we landed in Salem again. So from 8th grade to 12th grade, I had one school that I went to, school system. I was just kind of like a B- student. I didn't have very good grades. Like I said, I was very quiet. I had no real way of advocating for myself within the classroom. I don't think I would have known, what to do. Like if I was confused about something, I didn't, ask for clarification. I had gone to a writers' conference in Western Massachusetts when I was 16. And it was at that conference where I met all of these other kids from different backgrounds, like teenagers from different backgrounds. And I decided at that time that I wanted to go to college on the East Coast. I wanted to get away from Oregon. I got into the one that gave me the most scholarship money, which was a small women's college in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York. I became, very outgoing, very social. I had all these different friend groups. I still wasn't doing all that great in college, but at least I was going to class and turning in my papers and stuff. I was kind of, surviving and doing what it took. But I think I still had some of that educational trauma. I had great friendships, but then I also discovered drinking. It was like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. I can get out of my head. I'm free. But it wasn't long before I was, not doing well in my classes. I was doing things that, I look back now and kind of horrified. I started smoking and I was like, oh my God, smoking is amazing. I also developed an eating disorder. I graduated from college with no real plan. Like my friends were like, I'm going to vet school, or I'm applying for med school. And I was like, I'm going to work at a coffee shop because that seems fun. And I just didn't, I was 22, which I kind of can, chalk up to like, who knows really what they want to do at 22. I certainly did not. I kind of bounced around and was working all of these temp jobs, had no real direction, still drinking. And then finally one day my mom was like, you need to get sober. And so I just showed up in an AA meeting one day in 2001 and got sober. I slowly just kind of built a life for myself. I got a permanent job. I got a car. I got an apartment, and I became involved with this women's networking organization, and I started a chapter in Portland. I grew it to be the second largest in the United States, and thought, oh wow, this is I'm really entrepreneurial in a way that I never really knew before. And I had also started working as what's called a job developer, where I helped people with disabilities find jobs. And pretty soon I had my own contract with the state of Oregon. So that was when I was about 27, 28, 29. A friend of mine had been, whispering in my ear for a really long time, like, you need to, you should really, really, really think about writing, this story, this experience that you had when you were a kid. And so I started taking classes and started working on this manuscript. It's not published yet. I'm working on finding an agent for it. And I started a podcast that's not out yet, but I started a podcast called Voices of Survivors, where I interview other writers who have been victims of sexual assault. I got to chat with Rowena Chu, who was a Harvey Weinstein assistant in January. There's a reporter right now who's working on a story and, doing a lot of research into things like what happened to those trial documents. I developed a real interest in real estate investing. I found the therapist that I worked with when I was a child, when I was 8. She knew me from the trial. Yeah, I guess, my life has kind of come full circle. What I know, what has worked for me is therapy and outside support groups. And Therapy is expensive. I think there's so many resources out there that are free, through universities that have counseling programs. I just encourage people to get that in whatever form you can. But I also encourage people, if they can't afford therapy, there are support groups. There's I think there's the Sexual Abuse Survivors Anonymous, which I've never attended one of those meetings, but it's survivors helping survivors, and it's free. And, sometimes 12-step programs are not the bedrock of mental health, but they are free and they offer support. If there's nothing else, I highly recommend getting support, because it can be such an isolating experience. Because in many cases, survivors are cut off from their families and have extremely damaged relationships, as I can attest to.